deal of satisfaction. "That was Gavrila Ardalionovitch who just went out, wasn't it?" she asked suddenly, interrupting somebody else's conversation to make the remark. "Yes, it was," said the prince. "I hardly knew him. He is much changed, and for the better." "I am very glad," said the prince. "He has been very ill," added Varia. "How has he changed for the better?" asked Mrs. Epanchin. "I don't see any change for the better. What's better in him? Where did you get that idea from? What's better?" "There's nothing better than the poor knight," said Colia, who was standing near the last speaker's chair. "I quite agree with you there," said Prince S., laughing. "So do I," said Adelaida solemnly. "What poor knight?" asked Mrs. Epanchin, looking round at the face of each of the speakers in turn. Seeing, however, that Aglaya was blushing, she added angrily, "What nonsense you are all talking! What do you mean by poor knight?" "It's not the first time this urchin, your favourite, has shown his impudence by twisting other people's words," said Aglaya haughtily. Every time that Aglaya showed temper, and this was very often, there was so much childish pouting, such schoolgirlishness, as it were, in her apparent wrath, that it was impossible to avoid smiling at her, to her own unutterable indignation. On these occasions she would say, "How can they, how dare they laugh at me?" This time everyone laughed at her, her sisters, Prince S., Prince Muishkin, though he himself had flushed for some reason, and Colia. Aglaya was dreadfully indignant, and looked twice as pretty in her wrath. "He's always twisting round what one says," she cried. "I am only repeating your own exclamation," said Colia. "A month ago you were turning over the pages of your Don Quixote, and suddenly called out, 'There is nothing better than the poor knight.' I don't know whom you were referring to, of course, whether to Don Quixote, or Evgenie Pavlovitch, or someone else, but you certainly said these words, and afterwards there was a long conversation." "You are inclined to go a little too far, my good boy, with your guesses," said Mrs. Epanchin, with some show of annoyance. "But it's not I alone," cried Colia. "They all talked about it, and they do still. Why, just now Prince S. and Adelaida Ivanovna declared that they upheld the poor knight. So evidently there does exist a poor knight, and if it were not for Adelaida Ivanovna, we should have known long ago who the poor knight was." "Why, how am I to blame?" asked Adelaida, smiling. "You wouldn't draw his portrait for us, that's why you are to blame. Aglaya Ivanovna asked you to draw his portrait, and gave you the whole subject of the picture. She invented it herself, and you wouldn't." "What was I to draw? According to the lines she quoted, 'From his face he never lifted that eternal mask of steel.' What sort of a face was I to draw? I couldn't draw a mask." "I don't know what you are driving at. What mask do you mean?" asked Mrs. Epanchin irritably. She began to see pretty clearly, though, what it meant, and whom they referred to by the generally accepted title of poor knight. But what specially annoyed her was that the prince was looking so uncomfortable and blushing like a 10-year-old child. "Well, have you finished your silly joke?" she added, "and am I to be told what this poor knight means? Or is it a solemn secret which cannot be approached lightly?" But they all laughed on. "It's simply that there is a Russian poem," began Prince S., evidently anxious to change the conversation. "A strange thing, without beginning or end, and all about a poor knight. A month or so ago we were all talking and laughing, and looking up a subject for one of Adelaida's pictures. You know it is the principal business of this family to find subjects for Adelaida's pictures. Well, we happened upon this poor knight. I don't remember who thought of it first." "Oh, Aglaya Ivanovna did," said Colia. "Very likely, I don't recollect," continued Prince S. "Some of us laughed at the subject, some liked it, but she declared that in order to make a picture of the gentleman she must first see his face. We then began to think over all our friends' faces to see if any of them would do, and none suited us, and so the matter stood. That's all. I don't know why Nikolai Ardalionovitch has brought up the joke now. What was appropriate and funny then has quite lost all interest by this time." "Probably there's some new silliness about it," said Mrs. Epanchin sarcastically. "There is no silliness about it at all, only the profoundest respect," said Aglaya very seriously. She had quite recovered her temper. In fact, from certain signs, it was fair to conclude that she was delighted to see this joke going so far, and a careful observer might have remarked that her satisfaction dated from the moment when the fact of the prince's confusion became apparent to all. "Profoundest respect? What nonsense! First, insane giggling, and then, all of a sudden, a display of profoundest respect. Why respect? Tell me at once, why have you suddenly developed this profound respect, eh?" "Because," replied Aglaya gravely, "in the poem the knight is described as a man capable of living up to an ideal all his life. That sort of thing is not to be found every day among the men of our times. In the poem it is not stated exactly what the ideal was, but it was evidently some vision, some revelation of pure beauty, and the knight wore round his neck, instead of a scarf, a rosary. A device, ANB, the meaning of which is not explained, was inscribed on his shield." "No, AND," corrected Colia. "I say ANB, and so it shall be," cried Aglaya irritably. "Anyway, the poor knight did not care what his lady was, or what she did. He had chosen his ideal, and he was bound to serve her, and break lances for her, and acknowledge her as the ideal of pure beauty, whatever she might say or do afterwards. If she had taken to stealing, he would have championed her just the same. I think the poet desired to embody in this one picture the whole spirit of medieval chivalry and the platonic love of a pure and high-souled knight. Of course, it's all an ideal, and in the poor knight that spirit reached the utmost limit of asceticism. He is a Don Quixote, only serious and not comical. I used not to understand him, and laughed at him, but now I love the poor knight, and respect his actions." So ended Aglaya, and to look at her it was difficult indeed to judge whether she was joking or in earnest. "Pooh! He was a fool, and his actions were the actions of a fool," said Mrs. Epanchin. "And as for you, young woman, you ought to know better. At all events, you are not to talk like that again. What poem is it? Recite it. I want to hear this poem. I have hated poetry all my life. Prince, you must excuse this nonsense. We neither of us like this sort of thing. Be patient." They certainly were put out, both of them. The prince tried to say something, but he was too confused, and could not get his words out. Aglaya, who had taken such liberties in her little speech, was the only person present, perhaps, who was not